So we're going to be talking about Daniel 2 today, about prophecy. And just a little heads up that after the talk, I'm going to be activating it within the congregation. So you're not just going to be listening, but actually we're all going to actually take a little bit of time and actually saying to God, we are here, speak to us. So just to prepare you for that. It won't be scary, but there is an expectation that God will speak to you. So that's going to be really exciting. I was really just excited when I was preparing this talk, because actually Daniel is a book which I've not spent a lot of time in. And so it was just really lovely to kind of sit with this story. And that's one of the privileges of being able to give these talks, is you actually get to sit in passages which you maybe don't necessarily go to automatically. So this is really lovely, because let's face it, there are some really well-known stories in Daniel. But this is probably one of the, in terms of the top 10, it's not like the top 1 or 2, it's probably 3 or 4. So, but it's still a great story. So it starts with a dream from a king and ends up with the revelation of a kingdom, which is very, very different from this king's kingdom. So it ends up, so it starts with Nebuchadnezzar. And from now on, I'm just going to call him Neb, because I'm not going to struggle over Nebuchadnezzar 20 times in this talk. So when I say Neb, it's just purely just so I don't look a fool 20 times over. So we start with him. And so this was 600 years before Jesus. And actually, God gives him a revelation of what Jesus is going to do. So this is to a pagan king. Isn't that incredible? The ways of God are so mysterious, aren't they? It's just so encouraging to actually know that God speaks to us. So, very much in the Old Testament, I'm sure you probably know this, that prophecy in the Old Testament was basically through individuals. So obviously we have the prophets, and it tended to be individuals who are anointed with the Holy Spirit to speak God's word to the people of Israel. It's almost like a sort of a conduit. But in prophecy in the New Testament is different, in that it is an expectation that all of us will be able to hear the voice of God ourselves. We don't need an intermediary, but actually God can speak to us. And actually the biblical expectation is if we're following Jesus and we want to live a Jesus-shaped life, then actually hearing the voice of God and actually living a prophetic life is actually something which we can all participate in and which we're all encouraged to. And that's just really exciting, isn't it? That actually we can, God isn't distant, but that actually he is really available and actually longs to be part of our lives, our everyday lives. So we're going to start off with a little sort of canter through this story, which is in Daniel 2. So it's called Neb's Dream. And so the summary is that he has a dream. And the story is obviously not just a one-off, because he can't sleep. And it's not just a one-off dream. I think the way that it's written is like he has this dream repeatedly. And it's really bothering him because it's really kind of disturbing his mind. And so he calls all his astrologers and wise men in. And he says to them, tell me my dream and interpret it. And they're like, I'm sorry, Your Majesty, nobody can do that. You're asking, no wise man in the kingdom could possibly do that. In any kingdom, you're asking too much. He said, no, I'm absolutely serious. And he says, that the consequences are, I am serious about this. If you don't tell me what my dream was and what it means, you will be torn limb from limb and your houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. So there were big consequences here, and the wise men, understandably, were not very happy. They were basically, in fear of their lives. And so Arioch, who is the commander of the king's guard, is told to go and kill all the wise men of Babylon. That includes Daniel and his 3 friends who've been sort of elevated to positions of influence. So Arioch comes to Daniel, and Daniel is like, hang on, please don't kill me, as would be probably your first response. And he says, give me time and I will be able to interpret the king's dream. I'll be able to tell the king what he needs to hear. So his life is spared, and he gets his friends together, and he's like, guys, we need to get on our knees and pray. And then in the middle of the night, it's revealed to him in a vision what the king's dream was and what the interpretation was. And so then he goes and tells the king. So we're going to read a little bit about the dream and a little bit about the interpretation. So if you have Daniel 2 in front of you, then we're going to start off at verse 31. So it starts. So I'm reading from the NLT version, if that's helpful for anybody who's on their phone. In your vision, your majesty, you saw standing before you a huge, shining statue of a man. It was a frightening sight. The head of the statue was made of fine gold. Its chest and arms were silver. Its belly and thighs were bronze. Its legs were iron, and its feet were a combination of iron and baked clay. As you watched, a rock was cut from a mountain, but not by human hands. It struck the feet of iron and clay, smashing them to bits. The whole statue was crushed into small pieces of iron, clay, bronze, silver, and gold. Then the wind blew them away without a trace, like chaff on a threshing floor. But the rock that knocked the statue down became a great mountain that covered the whole earth. So here, at this point, I had a lovely slide, which is kind of giving all the interpretation of the kingdoms. So basically, the head was made of gold, and that was representing the king, so King Neb, Babylonian Empire. Then you've got the chest of silver, so obviously slightly lesser in value, so not quite as strong a kingdom. So that was the Medes and the Persians. And then you've got the sort of moving down the body. You've got the belly and thighs were bronze, and the legs. So bronze. So then it goes on to the Greek kingdom, and then you've got the Roman kingdom represented, Roman Empire represented, which the feet were a combination of iron and baked clay. So the iron is actually the strongest of all those metals. And obviously the Roman Empire was really a violent, very oppressive regime. And actually, the Roman Empire actually split into two. And so you've got the mixture of the iron and the clay represented in the feet there. But then you've got this rock, which is cut out not by human hands. See, the kingdom of Jesus, who comes and knocks down the statue. All those kingdoms are blown away like chaff. And actually, that kingdom, the kingdom of Jesus, fills the whole earth. Which is incredible, isn't it? It's incredible. So this is how Daniel kind of explains, gives that revelation, that interpretation of the dream. So he says to King Neb, during the reigns of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed or conquered. It will crush all these kingdoms into nothingness, and it will stand forever. That is the meaning of the rock cut from the mountain, though not by human hands, that crushed to pieces the statue of iron, bronze, clay, silver, and gold. The great God was showing the king what will happen in the future. The dream is true, and its meaning is certain. Oh, what a moment. It must, you can sort of sense it in that room. There must have been a pin drop, You would have just been absolutely just... the tension in the room, you can always feel it, can't you? So a truly cosmic prophecy. And I'm just thinking when Daniel was given that dream and the meaning, he was living in exile under this oppressive regime. What encouragement that must have given him to think that there's this king. Obviously, he didn't know the name Jesus, but he knew that there was a kingdom coming, not made of human hands, which was going to sweep away all the violence, all these man-made kingdoms, which kind of had set themselves up so proudly against God. But actually, God was going to come and do this kingdom revolution thing. So that's just a wonderful thing for us to hold on to in these days of empires and tyrant rulers. all across the globe who think that they are God, that actually God does hold the whole world in his hand, the whole earth, and he has plans and he has purposes, and actually his rule and his kingdom will triumph. So I just think, that's a really wonderful thing to take away from today's passage. But what we're going to do is we're going to have a look a little bit of kind of what we can learn from Daniel about prophecy, because that's kind of what what the aim of the talk today is, to talk about prophecy. It's such an incredibly powerful thing. I mean, this prophecy was the start for Nebuchadnezzar of a journey, and it was just such an incredibly powerful moment. And obviously for us, when we hear from the voice of God, it doesn't tend to be on such a cosmic scale, but actually its impact can be just as kind of wide-ranging and actually life-changing and life-transforming for people who hear prophetic words from God. So this is where, as I say, on my lovely slides, it would be all I had it in front of you, but if you want to note it down, these are just sort of some of the principles that we can learn from Daniel's story. So the first one is, we ask. This is what Daniel did, wasn't it? He asked God for revelation. He enlists his friends, they pray for help, and it's as simple. It's the same for us. If we want to hear from God, we need to ask. It can be something as simple as, God, speak to me. If we're following Samuel, look, your servant is listening. I don't know whether you've ever done that. You may not ever have done that. And actually, it is such a simple thing just to be able to say, I'm here, Lord, speak to me. So that's number one. Number two is God reveals. God is the revealer of mysteries. So in verse 27, it says, so this is what Daniel says to Neb. There are no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or fortune tellers who can reveal the king's secret. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has shown King Neb what will happen in the future. Now I will tell you your dream, the visions you saw as you lay in your bed. So God is the revealer of mysteries. So Daniel, when in his interaction with the king, is always pointing towards God. He knows he can't find out the king's dreams on his own. We can't find out, what God's plans are. I can't find out what plans are for Glyn without asking God. He might give me a word for Glyn or for anybody, but I can't do it in my own strength. And so when we're saying yes to God, when we're saying to him, yes, actually give me something which was going to bless somebody else, we're just very much saying, we can't do this on our own, Lord. We are, putting ourselves under his majesty and his direction and saying, will you reveal something to me? And Matt saw that a little bit in last week's service, didn't he? When he was saying, I just feel like there's some people who are really struggling with sleep. That was even before the heat wave. And actually that really, resonated with several people, including myself. I've really been struggling to sleep. And so actually several of us sort of went and had some prayer. And so Matt said that actually the person he was praying with reported they'd had a really, really good night's sleep after that prayer. And that's a little bit of just hearing God's voice and actually blessing another person with it. And so that's just really exciting, isn't it? Third thing from Daniel, God uses images. You might think, that's funny. I hadn't thought of that before. Well, I certainly hadn't thought of it before. I thought it was quite, when I looked at this passage, I'm like, when you may have heard at the front of church people saying, I think I've got a picture of, something like that. And you're thinking, is that biblical? Where does that come from? It is. It's really biblical, because actually God uses images. He uses the image of a statue to actually say so much more than, if he'd tried to kind of explain that whole story to Daniel, just through words, then, Daniel might have, lost some halfway through. But when you can hold a picture really does, say 1,000 words, doesn't it? It's just I remember I was praying for somebody once and just had a picture of a butterfly. And actually, for them, it was just incredibly meaningful. Just the right picture at the right time can just unlock just a whole situation as people just see that God sees them and God knows them, and it's really, really powerful. Number 4. So we've got number 1. So number 1, we ask. Number 2, God reveals. Number 3, God often uses images. Brilliant. Number 4, okay, this one's an interesting one. God interprets, but we also interpret, or sometimes misinterpret. But God is the one who gives Daniel the interpretation of the king's dream. So when we hear from God ourselves, we also want to ask God for the interpretation. So, when just taking that fairly simple example of the butterfly, I was really wanting to ask God, what does that mean for this person? What's the interpretation? And I will readily admit that sometimes I'll get a picture and I have no idea what the interpretation is. And I will ask God, say, please, what does this mean? Can you give me an interpretation? And sometimes I hear God's voice and sometimes I don't. And sometimes I might say too much. And sometimes, I actually need to learn sometimes to go, I don't know what the interpretation is. Because we're all just on a learning journey, and it's fine to actually say that, and to actually say to the person, I've got this picture of a butterfly. Does that resonate with you? Does that mean anything to you? Or you may, when asking God, saying, actually God is saying you need to settle where you are now and just open your wings and actually receive, just some of my light and warmth for you to grow stronger. So that may have been the interpretation. So that, but that's why we need to give interpretations with a lot of humility, because actually sometimes, we are human. And actually it says it in 1 Corinthians, doesn't it, that we prophesy in part. We see in part and we prophesy in part. So, we don't sort of say, God says this. Daniel does with confidence. But for us, we need to be, just hold it more lightly. Because the 5th thing is, obviously, we've got people who receive. When you're giving a word of prophecy, it's not just about you. I'm talking to Wilson. He has also got access to the Spirit of God, and he can test it, and he is receiving it. And we've probably all either ourselves received a word which was given with great heaviness, and it's like really sat over us. We're like, oh gosh, and it's actually quite affected us quite negatively, or we've just felt it was completely wrong. This isn't talked about much, actually, how you receive a word of prophecy. And in Daniel, in this situation, King Neb actually just, bows down and just prostrate because he's so in awe of what Daniel has said, and he receives it and is just like, oh my gosh, that is clearly from God. If you give a word of prophecy, I'm not expecting people to fall down. You do need to be sort of really aware that you need to be able to weigh prophecy, and that's your responsibility too. So you don't feel that just because somebody has given you a word that it's necessarily right. So you need to weigh it, bring it before God and say, actually, God, what are you saying? Actually for me, I received a word of a word from Rob Scott Cook once, and it was completely wrong. And it was probably the most encouraging thing that ever happened, because I thought, well, if Rob can get it wrong, I can get it wrong too. That's fine. And I told him this once, and he was so worried. He's like, oh my gosh, what was it? What was the word? And I was like, I have absolutely no idea, because it was a few years ago and I've just forgotten it. But the what I took from it was just the encouragement that we don't always get it right, no matter how experienced we are. So, but we do need to still be obedient. If we're wanting to, follow in that sort of that prophecy, that spirit-filled life, actually, in that sort of Jesus-shaped life, being open to God's word and passing it on to bless other people. Because number 6, we can learn from Daniel, is that prophecy brings life and renewed faith. So all the wise men are saved, literally, physically, from a very nasty death. So that's just like a physical representation of people being saved. But also, Neb praises God. This is the first step on his journey. I mean, later in his story, he still kind of reverts to his bad old ways. But actually, at the end of his life, he absolutely is kind of full on for God in terms of just sort of saying, yes, and praises God. And with a beautiful sort of kind of hymn of praise. Here, this was a really significant moment for him, receiving this prophecy and just sort of seeing that, the God of Israel is an awesome, amazing God. And, when we give a prophetic word from God, it brings life to that person. It's such encouragement to know that God is seeing you. And just this weekend, we were down in Dartmoor for the weekend with some good friends. And one of those, as part of the group, was just sort of saying how she had been invited by some colleagues to a sound bath, just to go and experience something completely different. And the person leading this, so it's basically where lots of music kind of just floats over you, you're just supposed to just relax and enjoy that relaxing period. But the person leading this sound bath then said, invite whatever being you want into the room. And she was just felt this complete sort of panic, and it was just really felt a sort of, I don't know whether she felt a darkness enter the room, but she was really worried and just was basically just praying massively for protection. Ephesians 6, she was just like over and over again the whole time. She was just really tense. The whole thing, this is just terrible. This is terrible. And anyway, and it was just the next day. I think it must have been on the Friday night. It was really bothering her all Saturday. It was really disturbing her, a little bit like the king in Daniel. And on Sunday, she went to church, went and got some prayer. And before she said anything, the person said, let me give you a hug. I just want to pray Ephesians 6 over you and the armour of God and your protection. And for her, she was just like, she's been a Christian for probably 20, 30 years. But, has been going through a little bit of I think just doubt, really. But for her, this absolutely has just lit a fire under her. Oh, wow. God has seen and he knows and he is amazing, and she is just completely on fire for God again. And it was just that simple, that simple act of somebody just hearing from God for her has unlocked just a whole new kind of wellspring of life for her. So that's why in 1 Corinthians 14, which is kind of where for the New Testament church, we hear a lot about prophecy. It says to eagerly desire the gift of prophecy, eagerly desire, and that word which they use is like to have real zeal for something and to kind of really pursue it. And I think probably as the DNA of Woody's is that we're on board with prophecy. But the reality is, how many of us are actually eagerly desiring it? Do we really kind of want to press in and kind of really just follow that example of the early church when they've just pressed into prophecy and they were wanting to bless and encourage other people in that gift. Because that is what prophecy does. It encourages and it blesses and it heals one another. That's what we can. And when we have people who come into the church, maybe it's their first time in the church, and they hear a word which just speaks to them, it's really powerful. So my daughter Mima went to a friend's baptism last Sunday, and all 20 of her friendship group went to this baptism, and she and 3 others out of that group of 20 are Christians. So there are 4 of them. And there was a word of prophecy given for one of the boys, just about having a really bad back. And literally all heads kind of turned to this lad and like, who told them? What's going on? Did you tell them? And the whole group like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. And so it was really, really impactful. And unfortunately, he didn't go forward for prayer. But, they're, as a group of 4 of them, they're now kind of praying for each person in that group, which is just absolutely delightful and wonderful. But that's what, the power of a prophetic word can have, just in literally kind of just for people to go, my gosh, God is real. He's here. And that's just really exciting, isn't it?